Hello, and welcome to Hoosier History with Vercingetorix. On our last episode, we discussed the Treaty of Paris and how the British ceded the Northwest Territory to the United States. In this episode, we're going to go over how the Northwest Territory was politically organized, how the citizens of the various parts of the Northwest Territory could form states and enter the Union, how land was divided up and sold, and lastly, a brief overview of the various Amerindian nations who lived in what is today Indiana and their history and some of their customs. While the Northwest Territory was controlled by the federal government, several states had their own claims to territory in that area. These states had charters that were originally created in the 1600s and said that their territory ran from sea to sea. These states included New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. And at one point, I saw this interesting map that showed Massachusetts, but what if it had kept its original boundaries in its charter, and you just see this Massachusetts kind of width area running from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And it was really weird seeing this band running all the way across the North American continent. And it just would have been really interesting if the states had stayed that way instead of splitting up into different ones, how they would have looked and how this band would have operated. It was very interesting. But the landless states, such as Maryland, were very concerned about this and worried that these states would become more powerful than them. In fact, Maryland made a condition of it joining the Articles of Confederation that Virginia would give up its claim to the Northwest Territory. Virginia later agreed to this. There were concerns and conflicts between the states over this power dynamic, but over time, the four states that had these land claims agreed to give them up. New York ceded its land claim in 1781 and Massachusetts in 1785. These states agreed to cede this land claim to the federal government for nothing in return. According to my research, it looked like they did this for the common good and in order to promote a strong and prosperous union. I could not find any evidence of a quid pro quo. Virginia, on the other hand, only agreed to give up its claim in the Northwest Territory in exchange for land in the Ohio River Valley being promised to veterans from Virginia who had served during the Revolutionary War. And Connecticut only ceded administrative control of its land claim to the federal government while maintaining legal ownership. It later sold this legal ownership to a land investment company that turned around and sold it to individual settlers. Now that the land was firmly in federal control, the next question was how were settlers going to purchase the land? In response to this question, the Confederation Congress passed the Land Ordinance of 1785. This law authorized surveyors to divide the Northwest Territory into roughly 6 mile square townships. Each township was divided into 36 sections, 1 mile square each. These are the same townships we have today. Section 16 of each township was reserved for a school. These sections were then sold at an auction with a minimum price of $1 per acre, which, due to inflation, was much more valued back then. There was even an official geographer of the United States position whose role it was to coordinate the surveying of the Northwest Territory. The first man to hold this position was named Thomas Hutchins. Thomas Hutchins was born in 1730 in New Jersey. He decided to join the British military at age 16, where he served as an engineer and surveyor in the French and Indian War. He even helped plan Fort Pitt. When the American Revolution broke out, he was stationed in London. However, he was caught exchanging letters with Samuel Wharton, who was a delegate in the Continental Congress. He was imprisoned for 7 weeks, but was then released. He escaped from England to France and from there to South Carolina. Once in the States, he joined the American government. Due to his extensive surveying experience in the French and Indian War, he was appointed the first geographer of the United States and started prepping to survey the Northwest Territory. While he was preparing, he wrote an historical narrative and topographical description of Louisiana and West Florida from his notes from his time in the British Army. In 1785, he started exploring the Northwest Territory. He started where the Ohio River met the Pennsylvania border. From there, he measured west 42 miles and then measured north in 6-mile increments. His team suffered from many Amerindian attacks. In a letter Hutchins wrote to George Washington, he said, quote, "The Indians have lately been very troublesome on the frontiers of this state and have killed several persons. They have even made an attack upon the town of Wheeling, which they have burnt, and killed upwards of 20 persons." Unquote. He later said, quote, "The surveyors, however, have proceeded with the survey, but I am afraid that they will be obliged to discontinue it unless they are protected by a military force." Unquote. The Hutchins then decided to pause the survey and restarted it in 1786, this time with military escort led by Josiah Harmer. He was able to survey 4 ranges of the 6-mile increments before he died of illness in 1789. Others continued his work. These surveyors had to endure bitter cold, animal attacks, surviving in an unexplored wilderness, and many attacks by Amerindians. But their sacrifice and heroism enabled the orderly settlement of the Northwest Territory. To address the governance of the Northwest Territory, the Confederation Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. This law stated that the Northwest Territory would be divided up into 3 to 5 states, and that the governance would start out with figures appointed by the Confederation Congress. These would consist of a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges. When a portion of the territory got to 5,000 free males in population, they would be able to elect an assembly and have a non-voting delegate in the Confederation Congress. When the population reached 60,000, they could elect representatives to draft a state constitution and apply to become a state in the United States, and importantly, that state would be on an equal footing with the original 13 states. Residents of the Northwest Territory had a Bill of Rights similar to the United States Bill of Rights, and slavery was banned in the territory. Originally, in this point of the episode, I was going to talk about the pioneers and their culture, but as I got into it, I realized there was just too much here, and I couldn't fit it into the second part of this episode, so that's going to end up being a later episode. So instead, I'm going to talk about the Amerindian tribes the American settlers would encounter. The Amerindian nations in this area had been migrating, conquering, and displacing each other for thousands of years. Early on, there were small bands of hunter-gatherers, but over time, these coalesced into larger groups, until we get about the time of the American Revolution, and just after in the early American period, there were 4 main tribes of Amerindians in what is today Indiana. These are the Shawnee, the Miami, Potawatomi, and Delaware. The Shawnee were first recorded living in the area where Kentucky meets West Virginia, but due to Iroquois attacks, they were pushed north. They smashed northward and displaced the remnants of the Mississippian culture that had preceded them. From here, they spread out into the Northwest Territory. Shawnee is actually Algonquin for Southerner, and their primary economy consisted of hunting and farming, although they also engaged in salt trade, where they would travel down to springs in Kentucky, harvest the salt, and then trade it with other tribes. They also had separate chiefs, one chief for civil matters and another chief for war matters. This reminded me of the Roman Republic governing system, where there were 2 consuls who governed at the same time. During the Revolution, there was a Shawnee assault on the town of Boonesboro. There, they killed, scalped, and mutilated Richard Calloway on March 8, 1780. During the course of this attack, they took 129 scalps and 77 prisoners, many of whom were sold to our old acquaintance Henry Hairbuyer Hamilton. But after heavy losses, the Shawnee decided to retreat. The Miami are first recorded as living around the Great Lakes, but were forced into Indiana due to Iroquois attacks. The Miami farmed in the summer, but then traveled west into the prairie to hunt bison in the winter, and they would move back and forth with the seasons. They grew a special kind of corn they called white corn that they said tasted better than any other kind. One of their main warrior leaders was named Little Turtle. He fought with the French in the French and Indian War, but during the Revolution, Little Turtle and the Miami switched to supporting the British. One of the primary opponents of Little Turtle was named Augustin de la Baume. He was born in France, and he was the 9th of 13 children and grew up in a working-class family. He served in the French and Indian Wars in the European theater with the French as a cavalryman, and after the war wrote 2 books on cavalry tactics. During the American Revolution, he joined the American Army with a letter of recommendation from Benjamin Franklin. He was appointed the Inspector General of the American Cavalry, and later resigned due to a command dispute with his superior. He then went west, declared himself an agent of the French king, and gathered 100 men, mainly French and American settlers, in an attempt to take Fort Detroit. And I just want to pause here and say that this is one of the things I love about both early American history and the Viking Age, is just the sense of YOLO you get from these guys. And I think it's due to low population density and having a large, relatively unexplored area just makes it where you get these incredible men with just drive and persistence who get together a small group of men and then go on to do something that is just going to change the course of history forever. And you get a lot of that in these 2 time periods, and it makes studying them very interesting. On his way up north towards Fort Detroit, de la Baume and his men raided a Miami village called Keokinga that is close to modern-day Fort Wayne. De la Baume camped on the Eel River, 3 miles south of where Little Turtle was staying. When Little Turtle learned of de la Baume's position, he got permission from the Miami War Council to gather up a war band and then head south to attack this interloper. At dawn, Little Turtle and the Miami Amerindians attacked de la Baume's men. The first casualty, allegedly, is a lookout who was tomahawked by Little Turtle himself. Due to being surprised, the French and American soldiers only got off 1 volley before they were overwhelmed and defeated by the Miami Amerindians. Augustin de la Baume and roughly 40 others were killed. Few managed to escape, and several of the prisoners were burned alive or mutilated. The Potawatomi name means keepers of the sacred fire. They were one of 3 parts of a confederacy of Amerindians that lived in what is today Michigan. Very appropriately, they were responsible for maintaining the council fires. They were forced from Michigan into Wisconsin by, you guessed it, the Iroquois. And the Iroquois are really just the problem child of all the Amerindian tribes in this area, just causing lots of problems. But after 1700, they moved from Wisconsin into Indiana. Similar to the Miami, they would farm in the summer and then hunt in the winter, and they allied with the French during the French and Indian War and later switched over to allying with the British during the American Revolution. The Delaware Nation was named after the Delaware River. This people was first recorded as living in Pennsylvania, Delaware State, New Jersey, and New York. They moved west, eventually settling in Indiana. Something unique about this tribe is that they tracked descent through the matrilineal line. Inheritance, clan membership, and social roles were determined by a person's maternal heritage. They also had a pictograph history of their people they called the Red Score. Other tribes called them grandfathers due to the important role they played in intertribal diplomacy. The stage is now set for the pioneers to start settling Indiana. The older states had ceded their claims in the Northwest Territory to the federal government, and the land ordinance had set up townships and a way for settlers to buy land. For the most part, the Amerindian tribes would oppose these settlements. But who were these pioneers, and what was their culture like? These questions will have to wait until next time. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the email I will put in the description of this episode. Until next time, take care.